"He hasn't smiled in 3 weeks," the woman whispered quietly as she passed the table, her voice barely louder than the soft hum of the restaurant ceiling lights, and Naomi Carter heard it before she even turned around, before she even saw the boy sitting stiffly in the leather booth near the window, his small shoulders drawn inward as if the air itself felt too heavy to hold, his pale fingers wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched, condensation dripping slowly onto the polished mahogany table while the late evening glow of downtown Chicago filtered through the tall windows behind him, painting the floor in long amber streaks that moved gently with the passing traffic outside, and Naomi paused mid-step with her tray balanced carefully in one hand, the weight of 3 ceramic plates steady against her palm, her eye settling briefly on the child as something quiet and familiar tightened in her chest, because she recognized that stillness, the kind that wasn't calm but fragile, like a thin layer of ice over deep water, and the boy coughed softly, not loud enough to draw attention, just a small sound that seemed to fold inward, as if he didn't want anyone to notice, but Naomi noticed, she always noticed, her gaze softening as she slowed her pace without meaning to, her black apron brushing lightly against her knees as she moved past the table, her worn non-slip shoes silent against the dark wood floor polished to a gentle sheen, and across from the boy sat a man in a tailored navy suit, his silver watch catching the low light as he checked his phone, his posture straight, composed, controlled, everything about him precise, from the crisp collar of his white shirt to the stillness of his expression. Richard Whitmore, though Naomi didn't know his name yet, only that he looked like the kind of man who carried silence with him, the kind that made conversations nearby soften without anyone realizing why. And the boy coughed again, slightly sharper this time, his fingers tightening around the glass as if he were trying to steady himself, and Naomi felt her steps slow again, her attention drawn back despite herself, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continuing around her, silverware clinking softly, low conversations blending into a gentle murmur, the faint scent of roasted herbs drifting from the kitchen, yet that small booth seemed somehow separate, like a pocket of still air, and the boy's breathing shifted, just slightly uneven now, his chest rising too quickly before settling again, and Naomi placed her tray down at a nearby service station, her movements careful and unhurried, her fingers briefly smoothing the edge of her apron as she glanced back once more, her expression thoughtful, hesitant, because stepping in wasn't her place, not here, not in a restaurant where boundaries were invisible but firm, and still she lingered, watching as the boy leaned back slightly, his eyes half-lidded, the overhead pendant light casting a soft halo across his face, his cheeks faintly flushed beneath the warm glow, and Richard Whitmore finally looked up, his brow tightening almost imperceptibly as he studied his son, his phone lowering slowly onto the table, his fingers resting beside it as if unsure what to do next, and Naomi felt the air shift, subtle but real, like the moment before rain, her heart pulling her forward even as her mind told her to keep walking, to return to the rhythm of orders and refills and quiet invisibility, but something in the boy's stillness held her there, and she took one small step closer, her breath steady, her eyes gentle, as the amber light from the window slid across the floor and the restaurant seemed to soften around that single quiet moment, the boy's fingers loosening slightly around the glass as Naomi Carter stood just a few feet away, noticing the fragile silence before anyone else did. Naomi took another slow step forward, her hands resting lightly at her sides, careful not to appear intrusive, her posture gentle the way she had learned years ago when approaching someone fragile, and the boy shifted slightly in the booth, his breathing uneven again, a faint tremor moving through his small shoulders as the restaurant's warm lighting reflected softly off the glass behind him, the hum of conversation continuing around them like distant waves. And Naomi noticed the small details others might have missed, the untouched plate in front of him, the way his napkin remained folded perfectly beside his fork, the faint sheen of perspiration near his temples despite the comfortable 72-degree temperature inside the dining room, and her chest tightened quietly because she had seen that look before, that fragile stillness, that quiet struggle that children sometimes carried when their bodies were trying to hold together something too heavy, and Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his expression composed but no longer distant, his hand hovering near the boy's shoulder before stopping midair as if unsure whether to interrupt whatever invisible moment was unfolding, and Naomi spoke softly, her voice calm and respectful. "Excuse me, sir. I just wanted to check if he might like some water with lemon or maybe a warm tea. Sometimes that helps when someone is feeling a little off," and Richard looked up at her, his eyes sharp at first, assessing, guarded, the instinctive caution of someone accustomed to control, but Naomi's expression remained steady, her tone quiet and professional, her hands open and still, and the boy coughed again, a small sound that seemed to fold into itself, and Richard's gaze flickered briefly back to his son before returning to Naomi. "He is fine, thank you," he said, his voice controlled, polite but firm, and Naomi nodded immediately, stepping back half a pace. Respecting the boundary without resistance, of course, she replied softly, but she did not move far, something in her instincts holding her there as the boy shifted again, his fingers loosening slightly around the glass before he rested his head back against the booth, his eyelids lowering as though the lights had grown too bright, and the soft glow from the pendant lamp above traced the curve of his face, and Naomi noticed his breathing again, shallow, uneven, and her heart pulled quietly, not out of urgency but empathy, the kind that came from memory rather than impulse, and the boy's hand slipped slightly from the glass, the condensation leaving a faint ring on the polished wood, and Richard leaned closer now, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "Ethan," he said quietly, his voice lower than before, and the boy opened his eyes halfway, his gaze unfocused for a moment before settling again. "I am okay," he whispered softly, though his voice carried the thinness of fatigue, and Naomi felt the quiet weight of the moment settle deeper, the surrounding tables fading into soft blur, the faint clinking of silverware distant, and she stepped forward again, just enough to remain respectful but present. "If it is all right, I can bring a warm cloth. Sometimes that helps when someone is not feeling well," she offered gently, her tone steady, and Richard hesitated, his fingers resting lightly on the table, the reflection of the window lights catching in his watch face as seconds passed, and the boy shifted again, leaning slightly toward the edge of the booth, and Richard's jaw softened, just slightly, as he gave a small nod. "Warm cloth would be fine," he said quietly, and Naomi nodded once, her expression calm. "Thank you, sir," she replied, before turning smoothly, her steps quiet as she moved toward the service station, her mind already focused, her movements careful and deliberate, and behind her the boy exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, while Richard Whitmore watched Naomi walk away, something thoughtful settling behind his composed expression as the amber city lights outside continued to drift slowly across the polished floor. Naomi returned within less than 30 seconds, the warm cloth folded neatly in her hand, steam rising faintly from the clean white fabric as she approached the booth with the same quiet steadiness, her movements unhurried, respectful, and when she reached the table she paused just enough to allow Richard to acknowledge her presence, her eyes briefly meeting his before she shifted her attention gently toward the boy. "Here you go, sir," she said softly, placing the folded cloth carefully onto a small porcelain plate before sliding it toward Richard, and he picked it up, testing the warmth with his fingertips, the heat subtle and calming, not too hot, not too cool, and he glanced at Naomi again, a faint flicker of appreciation passing across his otherwise controlled expression. "Thank you," he said quietly, and Naomi nodded once, remaining still for a moment as Richard carefully handed the cloth to Ethan, placing it lightly against the back of his neck, and the boy exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as the warmth settled, the small motion barely noticeable to anyone else but Naomi saw it, the way the tension eased just a fraction, the way his fingers relaxed against the booth seat, and the overhead light reflected softly off the boy's hair as he leaned back, his breathing beginning to steady in small, gradual shifts, and Naomi noticed the faint tremor fade, the fragile rhythm becoming smoother, and she spoke again, her voice low and gentle. "Sometimes the lights can feel a little bright when someone is not feeling well. We can dim the one above if you would like," and Richard looked up at the pendant lamp hanging directly over the booth, the warm amber glow suddenly seeming sharper than before, and he gave a small nod. "Yes, that would be helpful," he said quietly, and Naomi reached up carefully, adjusting the dimmer control mounted on the nearby column, the light softening gradually, the booth settling into a gentler shade of gold, and Ethan shifted again, his eyes closing briefly as if the softer light allowed him to rest more easily, and Richard leaned back slightly, his posture easing for the first time since Naomi had approached, his fingers resting lightly against the table as he watched his son, and Naomi stepped back half a pace, her presence still calm but unobtrusive, her instincts guiding her to remain close without intruding, and she noticed the untouched plate again, the small grilled chicken and steamed vegetables still arranged neatly, and she spoke carefully. "If he feels up to it later, we can also bring something simple like broth or toast. Sometimes that is easier when appetite is low," and Richard's gaze moved briefly to the plate, then back to Naomi, and something in his expression softened again, not fully, but enough to show he was listening. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, his voice lower now, and Ethan shifted once more, his head tilting slightly toward the warm cloth as his breathing continued to settle, and the surrounding restaurant seemed to fade further into the background, the gentle murmur of conversation distant, the faint sound of a jazz piano drifting from hidden speakers above, and Naomi remained still for another moment before giving a small, reassuring nod. "I will be nearby if you need anything," she said softly, and Richard watched her as she stepped away again, her movements calm, her presence leaving behind a quiet warmth. And as Naomi returned to the service station, Richard Whitmore looked down at his son, noticing the subtle change, the slower breathing, the relaxed shoulders, and for the first time that evening, the tension in his own chest eased slightly as the amber light continued to glow softly across the booth. Naomi remained near the service station, her hands lightly resting on the edge of the polished counter as she quietly observed from a respectful distance, her attention drifting back to the booth by the window where Ethan now sat more comfortably, the warm cloth still resting gently against the back of his neck, the softened amber light casting calm shadows along the leather seat, and the faint jazz melody floating through the restaurant seemed to settle deeper into the space, blending with the quiet rhythm of dishes being placed and low conversations that filled the evening air. And Naomi noticed the small change in Ethan first, the way his shoulders lowered another inch, the way his fingers no longer gripped the edge of the booth, and then something even more subtle. His breathing had slowed, the fragile uneven rhythm replaced with something steadier, softer, and Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on his son with careful attention, as if he did not want to disturb whatever fragile calm had finally settled, his hand resting lightly near Ethan's plate, not touching, just present, and Ethan opened his eyes halfway, glancing toward his father before quietly shifting closer, the movement small but meaningful, and Richard's expression softened again, his posture no longer rigid but gently attentive, and Naomi saw the moment when Ethan's hand drifted toward the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the folded napkin, and Richard quietly moved the glass of water closer to him, his motion careful, deliberate, and Ethan lifted it slowly, taking a small sip, the condensation catching the warm light as he lowered the glass again, and Naomi felt a quiet relief settle in her chest, the kind that did not need acknowledgement, only observation, and a few moments later Ethan spoke softly, his voice faint but clearer than before, "It feels better now," and Richard exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him almost silently, his shoulders easing in a way that suggested he had been holding tension far longer than he realized. "I am glad," he replied gently, his voice lower, warmer than before, and Naomi noticed the shift not only in Ethan but in Richard as well, the guarded distance fading, replaced with something quieter, more human, and the city lights beyond the window reflected softly against the glass, moving slowly as cars passed along the street below, their headlights drifting like slow waves across the floor, and Richard glanced toward Naomi briefly, his eyes thoughtful, then back to Ethan, and Naomi remained still, her presence unobtrusive, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, and Ethan leaned back against the booth, his eyelids lowering again, not from strain now but from comfort, his breathing calm, and the faint flush in his cheeks softened as the warmth of the cloth and dimmed light continued to ease him, and Richard reached forward carefully, adjusting the cloth slightly to keep it comfortable, his movements gentle, and for a moment he simply watched his son, his expression quiet, reflective, and Naomi saw something change behind his eyes, something that looked like relief mixed with surprise, as if he had not expected such a simple moment to carry so much weight, and the restaurant's evening rhythm continued around them, but the booth by the window remained wrapped in its own calm, the amber light soft, the quiet steady, and Naomi turned slightly to refill a nearby water pitcher, her movement smooth and practiced, yet her attention remained softly anchored to the small table where Ethan now rested peacefully, and Richard Whitmore sat beside him, watching the calm settle slowly, the tension in his posture fading as the evening light drifted gently across the room. The calm at the booth lingered like a soft blanket, the dimmed amber light resting gently over Ethan's small frame as he leaned back against the leather seat, his breathing now slow and steady, and Naomi noticed the faintest change in his posture, the way his shoulders no longer curled inward but rested naturally, as if his body had finally decided it was safe to relax, and Richard Whitmore watched closely, his gaze fixed on his son with quiet concentration, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, and after a few seconds Ethan shifted again, turning slightly toward his father, his voice soft but clearer than before, "I am not as tired anymore," and Richard's lips parted slightly, surprised by the improvement, his expression softening in a way that seemed unfamiliar even to himself, "That is good," he replied gently, his tone warmer, less controlled, and Ethan glanced down at the plate in front of him. The small portion of grilled chicken still untouched, and slowly, almost hesitantly, he picked up his fork, the movement small but significant, and Naomi noticed it immediately from across the room, her eyes softening as she saw Ethan carefully cut a small piece, lifting it slowly before taking a quiet bite, and Richard noticed it too, his shoulders easing further, his breathing deepening as relief settled into his chest, and for a moment he simply watched his son chew slowly, the overhead jazz melody blending with the quiet clink of silverware, and Ethan swallowed, then took another small sip of water, his movements more natural now, and Richard leaned back slightly, his hand brushing briefly against his watch as he exhaled, the tension that had followed him into the restaurant now fading in gradual waves, and his eyes drifted briefly across the room until they landed on Naomi again, standing quietly near the service station, her posture calm, her attention gentle but unobtrusive, and something thoughtful passed across his expression, something reflective, as if he were replaying the last few minutes in his mind, the warm cloth, the dimmed light, the quiet voice that had guided the moment without drawing attention, and Ethan leaned back again, his eyes growing heavier, not from strain but from comfort, and he rested his head lightly against the booth, the faint glow of the city lights reflecting softly in the window behind him, and Richard reached forward again, adjusting the warm cloth slightly, his touch careful and gentle, and he noticed the warmth still lingering, steady and calming, and Naomi quietly moved to refill a nearby pitcher, her movement smooth, the sound of water flowing softly into the glass container, and as she returned it to the counter she glanced again toward the booth, seeing Ethan resting peacefully, his breathing slow and even, and Richard sat beside him, still watching, his expression thoughtful, his posture relaxed for the first time that evening, and the restaurant's warm atmosphere wrapped around the moment, the distant hum of conversation blending with the soft glow of evening light, and Richard Whitmore remained seated quietly, his gaze lingering on his son, then drifting once more toward Naomi, as if trying to understand how something so simple had shifted the entire evening, the calm settling deeper as Ethan rested comfortably, and the city lights outside continued their slow, gentle movement across the polished floor. The quiet at the booth deepened as the evening moved forward, the warm amber light soft against Ethan's face as he leaned gently into the corner of the leather seat, his breathing slow and even, the faint rise and fall of his shoulders now steady, and Naomi noticed the stillness settle in a way that felt different, not fragile anymore but peaceful, like a room finally exhaling after holding its breath too long, and Richard Whitmore remained seated beside his son, his posture relaxed, one hand resting loosely near the edge of the table as he watched Ethan drift further into comfort, the faint glow of passing headlights outside the window moving across the polished floor in slow, quiet waves, and Ethan's fingers loosened completely, his fork resting untouched beside the plate, his head tilting slightly toward the booth cushion as his eyelids lowered fully, and Richard noticed it immediately, the subtle shift from fatigue to rest, and he leaned forward just slightly, careful not to disturb him, his movement slow and deliberate, and Naomi saw it from across the room, her expression softening as she watched Ethan fall asleep, the warm cloth still resting gently against his neck, and the jazz piano melody softened into a slower rhythm, blending with the gentle hum of conversation, and for a moment the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the quiet image of a father watching his sleeping child, and Richard's gaze lingered on Ethan's face, studying the calm expression that had not appeared earlier, the faint tension gone, replaced with peaceful stillness, and his fingers moved slowly, adjusting the warm cloth again, his touch careful, almost protective, and Naomi noticed something else then, the slight change in Richard's expression, the way his jaw softened, the way his shoulders lowered further, as if something inside him had finally eased, and he leaned back slowly, his eyes still on Ethan, and for a few seconds he simply sat there, breathing quietly, the faint reflection of the city lights catching in his eyes, and Naomi stepped closer to the service station, pouring a fresh glass of water, her movement smooth and quiet, and she placed it nearby in case he needed it later, her attention still gently anchored to the booth. And Richard's gaze lifted briefly, meeting Naomi's from across the room, and this time there was no guarded distance, only quiet acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the calm she had helped create, and Naomi gave a small, reassuring nod, her expression gentle, and Richard looked back at Ethan, his breathing deepening as he watched his son sleep peacefully, the tension from earlier fading completely, and the warm light wrapped softly around the booth, the surrounding conversations distant and muted. And for a long moment Richard Whitmore remained still, his eyes resting on Ethan, the quiet settling deeper, and Naomi stood nearby, her presence calm and unobtrusive, as the peaceful silence stretched gently between them, the evening continuing in slow, quiet rhythm, while the boy slept comfortably beneath the soft amber glow. Richard Whitmore did not move for a long time as Ethan slept quietly beside him, the faint rise and fall of the boy's breathing steady under the soft amber light, and the restaurant around them seemed to slow, the gentle clink of glasses and distant conversations blending into a calm background hum, and Richard's eyes remained fixed on his son, studying the peaceful expression that had replaced the earlier strain, and something shifted inside him, subtle at first, like a quiet realization, forming slowly, and he leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the polished table, his reflection faint in the dark window behind Ethan, and he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him deeper than before, as if tension he had carried for weeks was finally loosening, and Naomi noticed the change from across the room, the way Richard's shoulders softened, the way his gaze lingered not with concern now but with quiet disbelief, and she continued to move quietly through her tasks, refilling glasses, adjusting a nearby place setting, her presence gentle and unobtrusive, and Richard glanced down at Ethan again, the warm cloth still resting comfortably against the boy's neck, and he carefully reached forward, adjusting it slightly, his movement slow, protective, and as he did, Ethan shifted softly, leaning closer toward the booth cushion, his breathing calm, and Richard's eyes softened further, the faintest hint of emotion passing across his face, and he leaned back again, his gaze drifting across the restaurant until it settled on Naomi, and for a moment he simply watched her, the quiet efficiency of her movements, the calm steadiness in her posture, and something about her presence seemed to linger in his thoughts, the simplicity of what she had done, the way she had spoken softly, the way she had guided the moment without drawing attention, and Richard lowered his gaze briefly, his fingers tightening gently around the edge of the table before relaxing again, and he looked back at Ethan, his expression thoughtful, reflective, and the city lights outside shifted slowly, casting moving reflections across the floor. And the warm glow seemed to wrap around the booth like a quiet shelter, and Richard's breathing deepened again, his chest rising slowly as he continued to watch his son sleep, and Naomi stepped closer to the service station, pouring fresh water into a clean glass, her movements quiet, and she placed it nearby, then glanced toward the booth, seeing Richard still seated there, his posture relaxed, his gaze calm, and their eyes met again briefly, and this time Richard gave a small nod, subtle but sincere, and Naomi returned the gesture with a gentle expression before stepping back, allowing the silence to continue, and Richard looked down at Ethan once more, his eyes lingering on the peaceful stillness, and something in his expression shifted again, deeper now, the calm giving way to quiet emotion, as if the simple moment had reached somewhere inside him he had not expected, and he remained there, still and thoughtful, the warm amber light soft around them, while Ethan slept peacefully beside him, and the evening moved forward in quiet, steady rhythm. Richard Whitmore remained seated beside Ethan, his gaze resting on the calm rise and fall of his son's breathing, the soft amber light warming the quiet space around them, and for the first time that evening he allowed himself to lean back fully into the booth, his shoulders relaxing as he exhaled slowly, the faint reflection of the city lights gliding across the window behind Ethan, and his eyes softened as he watched the peaceful stillness that had replaced the earlier tension, and something inside him shifted deeper, a quiet realization forming as he remembered the past few weeks, the restless nights, the quiet worry, the subtle exhaustion in Ethan's face that no doctor's appointment or carefully planned schedule had seemed to ease, and now here, in a simple restaurant booth, the calm had come from something small, something gentle, and his gaze drifted toward Naomi again, watching her quietly move between tables, her step steady, her expression calm, and he noticed the way she carried herself, unhurried but attentive, the way she paused briefly when passing nearby tables, her awareness soft yet present, and Richard lowered his gaze for a moment, his fingers brushing lightly against the polished surface of the table as he considered the simplicity of what she had done, and Ethan shifted slightly in his sleep, leaning closer into the corner of the booth, and Richard instinctively reached forward, adjusting the warm cloth again, his movements gentle, careful not to disturb him, and the quiet settled even deeper, the faint jazz melody drifting through the air, blending with the low hum of conversation, and the soft clinking of glassware, and Richard's expression softened further, his eyes lingering on Ethan's peaceful face, and after a few seconds he slowly lifted his hand, motioning subtly toward Naomi, and she noticed immediately, her attention gentle as she approached quietly, her step soft against the polished floor, and she stopped at a respectful distance, her voice low. "Is everything all right, sir?" And Richard nodded slowly, his gaze briefly returning to Ethan before he spoke. "Yes," he said quietly, his tone calm but weighted with something deeper. "He has not rested this peacefully in quite some time," and Naomi's expression softened slightly, her eyes gentle as she glanced toward Ethan. "I am glad he is feeling better," she replied softly, and Richard hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke again. "Thank you," he said quietly, the word simple but sincere, and Naomi nodded gently. "You are welcome, sir," she answered, her voice calm, and Richard looked down again at Ethan, his expression thoughtful, reflective, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet between them warm and steady, and Naomi stepped back slightly, allowing the calm to continue, and Richard remained still, watching Ethan sleep peacefully, his breathing deepening again, the tension fully gone now. And as Naomi turned quietly back toward the service station, Richard Whitmore continued to sit beside his son, the soft amber light wrapping around them, while the evening moved forward in gentle silence and the peaceful moment lingered quietly in the warm glow of the restaurant. Richard Whitmore remained seated quietly as Ethan slept beside him, the warm amber light resting gently across the boy's face while the soft rhythm of the restaurant continued around them, the faint sound of glasses touching and quiet conversation blending into a calm evening hum, and Richard leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxed in a way that felt unfamiliar, his gaze still fixed on Ethan's peaceful expression as the boy's breathing remained steady, slow, and comfortable, and the warm cloth still rested lightly against his neck, and Richard reached forward once more, adjusting it gently, his touch careful, almost instinctive, and Ethan shifted slightly in his sleep, leaning closer toward the booth cushion, and Richard's expression softened again, his eyes lingering on the calm that had settled so naturally, and outside the window, headlights moved slowly along the street, their reflections gliding softly across the polished floor, and Richard exhaled quietly, the breath leaving him deeper than before, as if something heavy had finally lifted, and across the room Naomi moved calmly between tables, her posture steady, her attention gentle, and she glanced toward the booth once more, noticing Ethan still sleeping peacefully, and she paused briefly near the service station, her hands resting lightly on the counter, allowing the quiet moment to remain undisturbed, and Richard looked toward her again, his gaze thoughtful, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving a simple business card, placing it quietly on the edge of the table before standing carefully, his movement slow so as not to wake Ethan, and he looked down at his son one more time, his expression calm and reflective, then gently slid the card toward the empty space where Naomi would notice it, and he carefully lifted Ethan into his arms, the boy remaining asleep, his head resting lightly against Richard's shoulder, his breathing still steady, and Richard turned slowly, walking toward the exit with quiet steps, the warm light following briefly before fading as he moved past the doorway, and Naomi noticed him leaving, her eyes drifting toward the booth, and when she approached to clear the table, she saw the business card resting neatly beside the untouched plate, and she picked it up gently, her eyes lowering to read the name, Richard Whitmore, and beneath it a simple handwritten note, "Thank you for your kindness," and Naomi's expression softened quietly, her fingers holding the card for a moment as the soft jazz melody continued in the background, and she placed the card carefully into her apron pocket, then looked toward the window where the city lights continued their slow movement, and the booth remained still, the warm amber light glowing softly over the empty seat, the quiet of the moment lingering gently in the air as Naomi returned to her work, her movements calm, while the peaceful silence of the evening settled softly across the restaurant.